Hi, I'm Jennifer Bayuk, and I'm very happy to be at Mind the Sec. The name of it reminds me of, the London Tube, where you hear the recording, Mind the Sec. I don't know if that's where it came from, but that's what it means to me. And it's just so obvious that there's this mind the gap, the big gap between the platform and the train, and you have to step over it. But nevertheless, people need to be reminded all the time that that very dangerous gap is there. And that's why it's so appropriate for this conference to be named Mind the Sec. In cybersecurity, it has always been a threat, yet people seem surprised every time we have a cyber attack. Here I'm going to go through some of the history of cybersecurity and the efforts that have been made to actually help people mind the sec. I have been in the profession since it actually became information security. It used to be computer security. So I started back in the days of computer security. I was working at Bell Laboratories, automating the diagnostics of problems in the phone network when security became a big problem because people were hacking the phone network. So I was switched into kind of an intrusion detection role from being in expert systems development. And from there, had various jobs in security, including being a chief information security officer, information systems auditor. I ended up getting a PhD in being an academic, and now I have my own company, my own consulting business, lots of textbooks and things, and you can find some of my publications online if you look. As I mentioned, we're going to go through the history of cybersecurity, and the history of cybersecurity starts with computer security. In the beginning, computers were mainframes, much like the big ones that ran the phone network, but in the 60s, 70s, companies started to get their own mainframes, and in order to use them, you had to walk up and pass a guard and put little punch cards into the mainframe. So that was computer security back then, physical security. Then little innovations started where you could take a communications line, sit at your desk somewhere else in the building, and use the mainframe. But we knew who was there on the other side. And if we were concerned that someone else might walk up into an office and use a user terminal, we would put physical security around that office so that only the proper people could get to the mainframe. A chief information security officer on Wall Street, his first job in computer security was to crawl through the walls and ceilings to make sure that the lines from the mainframe went to the proper offices. Then people got workstations. These were mostly for office automation, documents, presentations, so nobody really thought that they needed a lot of security. But we put physical security around the whole building anyway. In those days, that was just always a problem with any kind of business activity. So that was covered by the physical security we had around the building. And then those users started to realize that the computers could do more than what we had on our mainframe. So they would dial out to other services and hire space on other people's computers that had different programs to help with their office automation. But anybody who had such a mainframe back then did have enough money to buy one. They were extremely expensive. So these were all pretty big, reputable firms. Nobody thought too much about the security of connecting to them. We were, after all, using their services. They were exposing their computers. And we started to use more and more information and share them on a local area network with our power users here, the ones that knew how to use workstations. Then the local area network was connected to the mainframe. So all of a sudden, these power users could get to the same information that other people only prior had in their offices or maybe in big printouts. And also, it made us realize that now we don't know who's at the other end of the line. It could be anybody, and people could connect to this LAN. And so we had to lock down that mainframe logically for the first time. We used access control lists, so we gave people usernames and passwords, and we partitioned the mainframe, much as clouds are partitioned today, into regions that different users could use. And we created entitlements to allow them to have access to just the data that they needed. And then these same power users found out that they could communicate with other companies for free, not having to pay for the time sharing or bulletin board services that were available at the time, by connecting to this government experiment called ARPANET. And all the big universities and DoD contractors were on it, and then soon all the financial firms were on it, and we could, and certainly all the telecoms were on it, we could exchange information with each other, one-on-one messages, and that was a huge innovation. It was also the beginning of the openness of this ubiquitous network, and there were a lot of people who knew it was a threat, including people at Bell Labs, because they were experimenting with ways to make sure that only authorized people could use the phone network. So they were looking at how to partition networks as a theoretical exercise and experimenting with real technology. One of those security researchers had a son who was just aghast at how open this email system was, and he wrote the first internet worm. And it was the ARPANET worm because the internet wasn't called the internet then, but this worm brought down all the email servers on the internet in like 1988. And so the experiment that Bell Labs was using to restrict unauthorized users from using the phone system, well, that was called a firewall. So AT&T was the only big company that was not affected by the Morris worm. And so now we all have firewalls between us and what is now the internet. Used to be ARPANET. And now almost everybody who connects to the internet has a firewall. Safe behind our firewalls, we put up web servers. The original e-commerce was just a catalog of our products and services with our phone number, and people would call us, and they were able to do business much faster and more efficiently by looking at the catalog on the web server. So there was no real commerce at that time, but it was still an issue that people were trying to get through into our systems, and they were trying to get through the telecom lines because they could then dial into our systems with the same lines we were going out to our time sharing and bulletin board services and use our computers, because computers were really expensive and they liked to do things like play games on computers, so that this became a real problem, guessing usernames and passwords and dialing into other people's phone systems and abusing it. So we all got these things called dial-back servers, where we only accepted calls from people's phone numbers that we knew. So we used caller ID to make sure that we were connecting with the right people over the phone lines. And then what happened is the port 80 problem. I was at a conference. I didn't know what they meant by the port 80 problem. I was in network security. I knew what port 80 was for. It's to get to the web server from the firewall. And as it turns out, if anybody can get to port 80, then they can start planting things in the web servers. The original Microsoft web servers let the people on the internet just upload any old file and it would execute. And that was a feature of the first internet information services, the IIS web server from Microsoft. So we had to harden all of those servers and put extra security on them if anybody was going to get there from the internet. And then we put up these firewalls between the servers that were accessible from the internet and the servers that shouldn't be, to limit the possibility that these vulnerabilities in the web servers would get into our network. So then all of a sudden, we're all dependent on all of this technology, and it must work all of the time, and our IT people start having to work all these hours, and we started to let them work from home because we knew how to dial in and out of computers. We gave that ability to our remote access users. And so they could connect to the LAN, and they used usernames and passwords. And what happened then is people started to guess the usernames and passwords of our home workers, and we had to start doing audits. When I was at Price Waterhouse, we used to hack using the dictionary, and we got into every client that we tried. And our recommendation was always to have token administration, multi-factor authentication. You had to have a handheld token with a number that changed all the time that matched what was on the server to get through that phone line. And we all still have those today. So we're getting along to 1999 when the Melissa virus strikes the internet. Everybody was putting in all these user terminals were being replaced with PCs, right? So now everybody had a PC and they had floppy drives and they got viruses, and the viruses came through the internet and they downloaded them. They had USB sticks that brought in viruses. And so we had to get antivirus software on all of our workstations. Then they downloaded the viruses through the internet, and also the information was going back to the internet, now to hacking sites. That was an innovation for the malware, the malicious software community. So we put in these proxy servers and we tried to make a list of bad guys and block communication to those bad guys. Originally, we tried to create a list of the places on the internet where our users were allowed to go. Some people still do that. It really is much harder than you would think, trying to limit access to only business sites, but those still exist today everywhere. Then we have intrusion anyway. Somehow it gets past all of those antivirus and proxy servers. So we put these listeners on our internet boundary intrusion detection systems. And so we got messages from the intrusion detection systems that there were viruses coming in. We then had to go hunt them down through our network security area. The clients, on the other hand, now started to come into the internet and in from the internet, and their passwords were not that great either, but we made them have stronger passwords. But this whole internet now is being monitored by external threats. And we could see through our logging and identity management systems that our clients that we had to put up, because the phone book was no longer the way we knew who had access to our systems, right? We hadn't had the login information for the clients. So we did have that, but they were sitting on this network, and our time sharing and bulletin board services were also on this network, the internet, and there were a lot of threats out there now listening to all the traffic. So we had to do something to protect our client information, and we created this certificate authority process so we could encrypt using some new secure sockets technology, which we all have today. We gave our clients certificates and we encrypted the traffic between our servers and their desktops. These certs on the desktops became very hard to manage, but that's how we started. And then we realized that these time sharing and bulletin board services were having the same amount of problems that we had. They were now being online and outsourcing arrangement services, and they were on the internet and we were on the internet. And now we realized we needed to encrypt the traffic from them to us as well and put firewalls in between our systems. So now we have all this extra physical security around as well. And everywhere we have any kind of connection or security device, that has to be in a secured place. And we get viruses anyway, and we have all of these different machines and hardened servers that we have to track. So we get an antivirus management server in order to know that the virus patterns are being updated, especially on our remote workstations. And then we realize these hardened server farms, we've got so many different kinds of servers now and so many different rules. Policy used to be a management directive for security. We shall keep our information safe. Vendors started to call every single security device some way to enforce policy. So we have now policy servers, which are really just rules for hardening servers and every other type of equipment. And we need this whole information security admin center just to deal with that. So the intrusion detection systems never did much, so we replaced them with intrusion prevention systems, which actually, once they found a malicious traffic on a network, it would actually do a TCP/IP reset and kill the network traffic, and that worked much better than the intrusion detection systems. And we had those logs now of the things that the attempted intrusions going on, and also the logs of all the activity on the servers in case some of that was needed to investigate some intrusion. And we had to put all that in a database, and we called it security information management, which is now a ubiquitous technology in security event and information management, SIEM systems. And then in order to see all that data, we had to have some way to visualize it. So we got screens and art and charts, we called them, to visualize all of this information that we now need to manage security. It's more and more red boxes on our network. So this brings us now into about 2005, and we know we're not safe on the internet. We are getting now early in 2000, we're getting viruses like Anna Kournikova, SQL Slammer, the I Love You worm. We're making headlines in security. And maybe we had one headline back with Robert Morris on the email, and we had maybe one in the late 90s. But now cybersecurity is in the headlines all the time, and we're finding out that our content, our data, is being mailed out by our users in the course of ordinary business. And when people find that out, they can intercept all of that data that's traveling in email on the internet. And and being uploaded, by the way, on purpose by some of our more nefarious employees, like some developers taking some code when they left our employ and put it on the internet so that they could download it for their next employer. So we have to start looking for bad activity, our information being sent out. We put content filters everywhere and tried to log potential incidents and put those in our arts and charts and SIEMs. But data is still, pretty much shared across the LAN. People are just depositing big files of data that they use for business. USB ports are becoming more and more depended upon for business activity, like putting files on a USB to send to a client. And we realized that these shares, we had incidents in the early 2000s, and we still have them, and we had them before, but they weren't as ubiquitous, of people just going into data centers and stealing disks just to get the data off them so they could sell the data. So we had to start encrypting all of the disks. So if we had keys on chips in the data center, we encrypted data shares and USB ports. We're also now encrypting the traffic coming in and out of the third parties. Not sure I mentioned that before. But we realize we still have problems. We still get hacked. So we create a way of scanning our own systems from the internet so that we can tell if we're vulnerable. We have people started out by having an internet security lab scanning themselves, but now there are ubiquitous scanning services that you can get to scan your web servers to see if you are vulnerable. And we find out from our scanning services, yes, we are vulnerable, and all of the same mistakes, the top 20 SANS mistakes, the coding mistakes, now a big focus of the whole building security in movement, is easier to detect if you have a specific web access firewall, we call it, to sit in front of the web server and between the traffic coming into the internet, into the web server, to just look for all of those coding errors that are cut and pasted by developer as they move through different jobs and use the same code. We all have the same bugs. So we have web access firewalls to take care of that. So technology is changing so fast that it's quite a chore to track all of this. But we still know that we are vulnerable. How do we know? Because there's a lot of events. Now we've got headlines all the time of hacking events. We know it could happen to our friends and family systems, so it's happening to us. And we start to encrypt everything, even our remote access. I mentioned our third parties. And we have all of a sudden a new technology, wireless security. Our users create a wireless network, attach it to our LAN. If you were like me when this happened and I was a chief information security officer, I found out 2 weeks after it had been installed and quickly just, latched that VPN and the token administration onto that wireless network. That's what most people did. So it is, threat, countermeasure, threat, countermeasure, threat, countermeasure. The threats are still out there. How do we find them? We decided to put some sacrificial system, is what we called it in the Bell Labs days, but now we call them honeypots. There was a famous espionage story, Cliff Stall, The Cuckoo's Egg. If you haven't read it, good book. This is the way that he caught the bad guy. And it is a server that you put out in your hardened data center and put interesting looking data on it that looks like trade secrets and customer info. And you don't use it for business. So anybody that logs into this is obviously a hacker. So the honeypot catches a hacker like flies are caught in honey. When they land on it, they get caught. So that's why we have honeypots. And then we start saying, okay, all of these boxes are getting very, very hard to manage, as I mentioned. So what we do is we go back to the idea of the mainframe. We get a virtual server. We break it down into components. We get a virtual machine monitor and put virtual machines in it. And then we can put security on each machine with code instead of having to go to every machine and install something and have a policy server, entry for this. We can kind of automate the security by having these microservices that we control, and we take all of our third-party traffic and we make it go there so we can lock down our third parties into some specific service with its own set of DMZ level, demilitarized zone is what we call this border between us and the internet, and we put these demilitarized zones at the micro level in virtual servers. So that gives us a little more assurance from the third party angle, but we are still getting hacked. So what happens then? This is very complicated to manage. It's very hard for an engineer to figure it out and how to secure it. So we've realized that vendors who do this probably do it more efficiently and at larger scale than we do. So maybe we should take advantage of their expertise and go put some of these microservices in the cloud. So we hire the clouds. Of course, the clouds don't have the same level of security, especially when they first started, as we do. So they get hacked immediately. So we have to then create security. I missed this little thing on the smartphones. Yeah, we needed lockdowns on those too. Okay, so we get a cloud access firewall that allows us to get to the cloud and nobody else to get to our cloud, unless we want them to. But we create these firewalls in order to have only our authorized users get to the cloud. And then we secure the cloud itself so that no one other than our cloud access firewall can get there. We start monitoring the cloud the same way we were monitoring our own operations. And so we have dashboards over in the cloud, logs, statistics, etc. We encrypt the disks. Everything that we did there becomes our responsibility to make sure is happening in the cloud. The cloud people are not adding that security unless you ask for it and know how to configure it yourself for the most part. And then you take your internal labs or scanning services that you were looking for vulnerabilities, and you point them at your cloud to make sure that you don't have vulnerabilities in your cloud. So pretty much the same theoretical concepts you're doing internally, you're applying to your cloud. Scoring services now show up. You're not doing this, somebody else is. Some independent company decides they're going to score your security. They're going to create an algorithm and a metric and say, this is how good or bad your security is on a scale of 1 to 10 or whatever they decide. 1 to 100 maybe, 1 to 8. These scoring services start publishing these scores for companies that are not their clients. So now you have to go find out what these scoring services are doing in the financial services industry. We actually had huge negotiations with these scoring services and came up with some kind of way of how you could trust a scoring service or not trust a scoring service. But they are out there So it's best to try to figure out what they're doing and deal with them and come up with best practices that everybody agrees on. So whatever you look like to the outside world in the internet, it doesn't embarrass you and give you a public relations issue. So now, here we are in about 2008, and we still have hacks. How do they get in? They get in the same way the users get in. For the most part, they're attacking the users' desktops, the external users' desktops. They are going on social media and finding the names of internal users, and they're finding out enough about them to take over their access. Or they might be hostile insiders, which means they're already in your network, so they're just taking data that they have access to. They're at your clients. They're taking the client path. They're stealing your client authentication, and that's how they're getting into your servers. So way complicated, right? Now where do we go from here? Governance, risk, and compliance. GRC, been around since the 1980s, having policies and procedures and everything. But now governance, risk, and compliance is really the method by which large companies or even small companies can figure out whether they've actually covered all the data flow. Lots of checklists, lots of ways to know that your inventory is covered by your security tool set, and whether or not it's effective in preventing incidents. You take the events that you have and you look at your controls. Governance, GRC, actually in the 80s stood for governance, risk, and control. It's only the vendors that started to sell the systems that allowed you to automate governance, risk, and controls. They renamed the C compliance because compliance is an easier excuse to spend money on security controls than just plain controls. So GRC systems are everywhere. Of course, your cloud vendor needs them, your third party needs them in order to know that they're secure, you need them. But in addition, as an enterprise, you need a third party oversight module on your governance, risk, and compliance system, right? So here we have all of this stuff we all do all the time to try to secure our systems. What is happening today? Why do we still have all of these hacking incidents and the pages, newspaper stories are getting worse and worse? Well, it's because of this threat that's been around the whole time, the advanced persistent threat. The nation-state espionage is starting just to get a little bit more bold. They used to try to stay in the background. They were always trying to hack the same way all of the criminal hackers were, but now they are actually making headlines. They are damaging our computers and infrastructure to the extent that we need to consider them a separate type of threat to thwart than just the criminals. Different type of adversary. There is a word in some American Indian language, Koyaanisqatsi. There was a movie, Koyaanisqatsi, and you look at a diagram like this, and if you saw the movie, you'd remember it because the translation, and the movie's about industrial age or whatever, but the translation is life that calls for another way of living. In cybersecurity, we have used every piece of technology in pretty much basically the same way as when we added it to this architecture, if you can call this an architecture. If you have a security architecture, you have a security architecture. Is it a good one? Right? If you designed this from the ground up, would you layer all of these boxes on top of your technology like this? Something just to think about. This is where we are in the history of cybersecurity, and the participants of this conference can use this as a starting point and mind the sec. Thank you.